Hey y'all, Mr. E Jeep Shop here. I took this thing to URI a few weeks back. It did pretty good. That was a shakedown. First time I've really done any off-roading with the Iron Duke in it. And I discovered a few things that I feel like I should probably try to address. Most of which had to do with fueling. It was flooding pretty good whenever I was going up rock obstacles on an incline. Even when I was just sitting on an incline, if the incline was enough, it would run rich and it would sometimes load up and stall. Another issue I had was this gas pedal flipping off. That's totally my fault. But I've got to do something about that. I've got to attach this to this aftermarket gas pedal somehow. Possibly by welding this to it, cutting that off and welding that to it. This is the original throttle linkage, why it's just sitting in here. That's one of the ideas that I've got. And also with the Iron Duke, this valve cover sits high enough to where when the carburetor was sitting on just half an inch of a spacer plus my half-inch homemade adapter spacer, the throttle cable was having to go way below the valve cover here, and it had a weird little bend in it. So if I space the carburetor up some more, that should allow the throttle cable to just be straight, and that'll be better for the throttle cable's life. That does mean I'm going to have to replace these spacers, but I'll get to that when I get the spacer done. The studs will have to be longer to get through the spacer. So I've got a chunk of Delrin here. From my research, Delrin does okay in gas, so I'm going to give it a shot. I've already cut the outline and marked where the holes need to be, and then with that X-Acto right there, I marked where the center hole needs to be. So I'm going to be spending some time on the mill, but probably not tonight. Next issue I had was with the Weber, and this is kind of a known thing. If you Google Weber DGV climb or make my Weber DGV climb, anything like that, you'll see that a lot of people have this issue, and it has to do with the emulsion tubes being back here and the float bowl being in front of it. So fuel enters the float bowl, and then the float obviously shuts it off, so the fuel's at a level. Well, when you're on an incline, this float bowl is facing forward. So on an incline, the whole thing is like that. So therefore, the fuel level on the front of the bowl is lower and higher in the back, which means the fuel level is higher up on the emulsion tubes. That will make it run richer just by itself. Not a lot you can do about that. There are some things you can do by adjusting the float to help that, and then also the carb cheater will help with that, which, by the way, I have a carb cheater, and I've just gotten the version 2, which has an even bigger valve. So hopefully that will help with that. But I believe my bigger issue was whenever I was going over rocks at any type of speed to make it over, because the thing was kind of flooding, I believe gas was splashing out of the vent and getting into, obviously, the Venturi area, as well as this area, which down in there is the air corrector jets that go to the emulsion tubes. So instead of the emulsion being emulsion, the emulsion was just being gas. And then beyond that, even, what I noticed is down there in the emulsion tube area, if you can see it, notice the gasket around those air corrector jets right in the middle, up against the wall. It looks like there's a hole, and that's because there is. And this is apparently a known thing that isn't really talked about a whole lot. But this gasket that I got from Pegasus, I guess it was, has a hole right there, which I believe is for an earlier model DGV. Well, what happens on this particular model is that hole allows raw gas from the float bowl to go past that wall into the air corrector jets, which feed the emulsion tubes. So at an incline, if gas splashed high enough to hit the gasket, it was getting in there. And if nothing else, it was saturating the gasket up in there and then making the air mixture in that channel above these richer, making everything richer. Worst case, liquid would splash up in there and splash into those jets and just... So obviously for the Venturi part, I plugged this vent. I just took another piece of Delrin I had, cut it to shape, knocked it in there. So we no longer have a vent from the fuel bowl into the filter area, so it can't get into the Venturi area or that area right there, which feeds air to the emulsion tubes through the corrector jets. So that was one mod. Second mod is a gasket. There is a company, I think it's WeberJets.com, that makes a gasket that's correct for this model carburetor. They're in Canada, so shipping took a while, and I even had to pay import tariffs and all of that mess. So easy fix, undo these 6 screws and that one E-clip. Never forget that E-clip. And keep track of it, because if it gets stuck to the end of one of these and you go screwing it in there, it'll actually fit through that hole if you push it and you won't even notice. But anyway, this is now trash. The new gasket is right here. I got 3 of them just because, you know, I had to import it. And if I'm paying tariffs and shipping, it costs no more in tariffs or shipping to order 3. Well, tariffs are probably a little bit more. This looks like a thicker gasket too than that one, but maybe that's a good thing. Who knows? But you'll see right there, there's no hole. So I'm hoping that between plugging that and then getting the correct gasket that seals that channel from the float bowl, that will take care of it. And then the carb cheater can take care of the rest. Now, as far as the vent goes, you can't just plug a vent and have no vent to the float bowl, because then when fuel's getting pumped in, it'll pressurize it and it'll vapor lock. This particular carburetor has a vent channel already that has already been opened. So all I had to do was screw a barb in there, run a hose through a rollover check valve, and then down to a filter zip tied to the frame, and I've got a vent. Some of the earlier ones that I've seen on some of the websites like Pirate 4x4, and there's a few others. I think there's a Toyota forum that shows people had to actually drill through into that channel because that hole wasn't there. This particular one, this later model that doesn't have the circle there, it's already open. So it already had an external vent as well as the internal vent. I don't know why they needed both, but either way, plugged that one. I've got this one that should be sufficient. And I'm about to put this gasket on there, put the lid back on, and then, like I said, hopefully that solves the climbing problems. I won't really be able to test it until next year because URI is really the only place to wheel around here. And URI is going to be closed starting next week or the week after, and it won't open until mid-April. But maybe I can find some time to drag this thing out to the mountains and do some climbing on some property that I know of out there. We'll see. And here's the gasket setting on top. First impression, it doesn't line up right. It looks like I simply need to trim this around basically that right there. I need to trim back, and then the whole thing can slide forward. It's close, but the fact that it's covering the air corrector jets, that's going to prevent it from seating. So let me trim that right there, right along there. And we'll see how that fits. All right, that did it. We're good. It's not springing anywhere anymore. Fits around there. The holes are lining up. And it rests, however. So let's get that top back on. Probably gonna need both hands. I know I'm gonna need both hands because of that choke arm. Yep. Second issue. The gasket's tight around that air corrector orifice. I'm not going to call it a jet because it's a bushing. It's not replaceable. So that was making the whole thing stand up because the gasket was not pressed down. So now that I flipped it over, I can press that down. I'm not going to use this tool. Could use a screwdriver. Probably should drill the hole out, but we're going to try it like this first. Now it seems the gasket is good. And let's see if it sits down. Yes, that's much better. Still has a little rock to it, but barely at all. And that will get taken up by the torque of the screws. Don't over torque them. And you also have to pay attention to the tightening pattern because you can break things like this. So you want to kind of snug these first and then just kind of go back and forth between this and this. Don't try to like just tighten the middle or tighten the back and then get it in a bind. You want to make sure that you just creep up on it in a pattern so it's flat and pushes down. And then we've got that. That needs to this is the biggest pain of doing this. Okay, there we go. Put that all the way up. And slide it on there. This is really fun with one hand. But, you know, who am I to complain? Almost at it. And you think that's fun. Putting that little clip on is a blast, because the last thing you want, if you don't have this plugged, you definitely don't want it in there. And if it's on the engine, you definitely don't want it going down there. So let me get to that. I can go ahead and drop these in. I've thought about replacing these with Allen's. It would make sense. I really don't like straight slot screws. I don't know of anybody that really does. But these are also a soft material. Probably so you don't strip anything out. So I just keep using them. There we go. They're all started. See that? Just finger snug and do that to the rest of them and go around it a couple of times and then tighten it up. Everything's snug down and that looks so much better. There's no way gas can get into there or in the Venturis anymore. Any splash has to go out that port. All right, I got the carb just sitting back on there and I'm gonna put a filter on it. And that'll do it for this video. Just wanted to kind of walk through some of the things that I'm doing on this, and then I'll be able to drive it around the block at some point here. But other than that, I'm not going to be able to really test it until I can get this thing several hours away in some direction. And there's the carb spacer. I'm going to use these little bonded gasket spacers as gaskets on top and bottom. But that's the guy right there. Not bad. A little bit of scalloping there from the mill. The other side turned out real smooth. Slides right on. As I mentioned, those studs are too short, so I ordered some more from McMaster Car, and I'm going to go ahead and remove those now.